we're very fortunate, as I said earlier, to have Jeff Delmon from the World Bank here. So we thought it would be good, before we open up to questions from all of you, we thought it would be good to get Jeff's perspective on some of the issues we've talked about. So my first question for you, Jeff, is how is the World Bank supporting the development of PPP frameworks in the region?
The World Bank is doing a lot of work on PPP programs and frameworks throughout the region. Sometimes you think about the World Bank as financing infrastructure and spades in the ground and cement in the ground and big, huge constructions that we can put our nameplate on. But actually, to make those successful, you've got to get the framework right. You've got to get the program right. And obviously, as you said, it's sort of a joint effort. You can't wait till the framework is perfect before you do the investment, but also you don't want to not touch the framework while you're doing the investment. So it's learning back and forth, this iterative process, which makes it all quite exciting. And we're working, across the region, huge amounts in places like Indonesia and Vietnam and countries that are just coming up like Laos and Myanmar, engaged at very different levels in each of those countries. And if I can thinking forward as to additional questions, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how this framework fits into these really interesting countries and the dynamic once you get into it. And you look at the framework, and it's this, you've described to us this very, logical and sensible, and here's how you approach it, and all the beautiful framework and how it all fits together. And then you get onto the ground, and you get into these countries, and everything is completely complicated, and often the incentives are going in different directions, and you have different parts of the government with different incentives. And especially you look at the contracting authority. This is the part of the government that owns this project. They are the center of your attention because they're the ones that are going to make this happen. The Ministry of Finance can do all at once, planning, procurement, everybody can be supporting, but that contracting authority has to be the center of your focus. And often they don't have an incentive to do PPP. They're not interested in this because they've got enough of a day job delivering their own infrastructure portfolio. And now you come along and tell them, actually, you should take the most sensible projects, the most financially viable projects, the most interesting projects, the biggest, sexiest projects. You're going to take those away and give them to some private company to develop. And you can imagine the minister of whatever this line ministry is thinking, my job is hard enough. Why in the world would I do this? And especially, as you were saying, you get a one-year budget. So I don't care about what happens 5 years from now. I'm having a hard enough time dealing with tomorrow and this year. And my argument for getting more budget next year is spending my budget this year. And now I'm supposed to spend all this money to get private sector in. And this is oversimplified, but it's actually a really important issue. And it's not that the line ministries are working against you or they're anti-private sector or they're anti, innovation or development. They are pro their sector. They're pro what they've been told to do by the system they're working in and by the government that they're working in. And so often these central authorities need to set up this framework, not just to protect the budget and to protect the government and to drive a really good program, but also to create these good incentives. How do we help line ministries see the benefits of this over the long term? And those benefits really accrue to the central ministries, to planning and finance and economics. Those benefits are really more visible for those central ministries. And that's where we get frameworks that provide advantages, provide incentives for line ministries, for contracting authorities to go down the PPP path. And that's where we set up frameworks and structures for funding of development costs. And again, if I'm the contracting authority, I get my budget to spend on infrastructure. I want to see shovels in the ground. I want to see concrete in the ground. I don't have any of that money that I can take away and spend on very expensive preparation. And so the framework sets up money, extra budgetary money to do that. Sometimes those benefits, because they don't accrue till later, we also set up funds of money that can be contributed, cash. It can go into the project and buy down the cost of the project. And that money would otherwise have to come from the line ministry's budget. And again, their incentive is to get their budget into the ground. And we're talking about money 3-4 years ago from now. So we provide extra budgetary money, and not all of it, but a portion of it, just the right incentive, the right balance to get them moving in that direction. Or we provide contingent liabilities, so guarantees or even other sources of subordinated debt, other mechanisms to bring down the risk of the project. And that reduces the cost of private financing. And again, makes it more interesting for the contracting authorities to go into PPP. So I love this area. My background is on the project side. Projects are great, but taking a step back and look at this framework is so important, so interesting. And the political dynamics, the sociological dynamics, the philosophical dynamics, the psychological dynamics of putting together a framework are fascinating once you get onto the ground. Thank you.
So my second question was, what do you see as key elements of good practice in establishing a PPP framework? And my third was, what are some examples of good practice around the region that you see? Is there anything you want to add on those couple of questions?
Thank you very much. On the first one, just a quickie. I was always told that we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. And we should use them in those respective proportions. And that we have a tendency, and I'm speaking for myself and the World Bank and frankly everybody, we have a tendency to know some good approaches to frameworks. We've seen them in other countries. We've seen them work really well. We go into a developing country or even a country that has a framework, and we try to bring in and slap this other framework on top of theirs. And it just doesn't work. And it's just going to frustrate everyone. You do bring the knowledge. You do bring the lessons learned. You do bring the intelligence from these other mechanisms. But there's no such thing as the ideal framework, and there's no way you can bring it in. So when South Africa developed their framework, they brought the British in. They learned a lot from the Brits, but they set something up that was different. When the Mexicans started up, they brought the British in again, but they set up something very different from the British Mexicans because they learned, they knew, they thought, and they tried to develop. But I've been involved in a few countries where, good intentioned people brought in frameworks from other countries and tried to impose them, and it doesn't generally work.